Who was Henry VII? Henry VII, also known as Henry Tudor, was King of England between 1485 and 1509. He was the father of Henry VIII, Arthur Tudor, Mary Tudor, and Margaret Tudor. But really, where did Henry Tudor come from? Henry Tudor was the son of Edmund Tudor and Margaret Beaufort, and he was born just 3 months after his father Edmund Tudor died, and his mother Margaret Beaufort was just 13 years old. Henry Tudor had connections to the throne through his father's side, who was a blood relation of King Henry VI, while his mother Margaret Beaufort was the great-granddaughter of John of Gaunt. Henry Tudor therefore had a slight claim to the throne of England, however, it was a weak claim. Henry was brought up by his uncle Jasper Tudor during a time of unrest within England known as the War of the Roses, or the Cousins' War. This was a 30-year-long conflict between the House of Lancaster and the House of York. When the House of York firmly established itself as the rulers of England, Jasper Tudor took Henry out of the country and sought refuge in the Duchy of Brittany. However, a few years later, the Yorkist king Edward IV died, leaving his throne to his son, who should have been Edward V. However, the boy was never crowned, and his uncle Richard took the throne for himself and became Richard III. The House of York was now divided, fighting among themselves, and Henry Tudor took this opportunity to invade in 1485. He landed at Milford Haven in Wales and advanced towards London. Thanks largely to the desertion of his stepfather Lord Stanley, he defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field in August 1485. Thereby claiming the throne, and he was crowned on the 30th of October. To further secure his claim to the throne, Henry Tudor, who was a descendant of the Lancastrian line, married the Yorkist princess Elizabeth of York, thereby joining the two houses of Lancaster and York and effectively ending the War of the Roses. Henry's throne, however, was far from secure. Many influential Yorkists had been disappointed by the change in regime, and many powers in Europe doubted Henry's ability to survive. Most were willing to shelter claimants against him, and Henry VII was plagued with conspiracies until nearly the end of his reign. There was an uprising in 1486, just a year after Henry Tudor became king. However, this was ill-prepared and easily squashed, but in 1487 came a much more serious revolt of Lambert Simnel, who claimed to be Edward, the Earl of Warwick, who was George Plantagenet's son, and therefore have a claim to the Yorkist crown. He gathered a formidable amount of support, but luckily for Henry Tudor, these rebels were defeated in a hard-fought battle. Then in 1491 came an even more serious threat with the pretender Perkin Warbeck, who claimed to be Richard, the younger son of Edward IV. Incredibly, he had a vast amount of support and invaded England 3 times before he was captured in 1497. Despite his marriage to Elizabeth of York to have been a political match, it is said that they grew to love one another deeply. And they went on to have 4 surviving children: Margaret Tudor, Arthur Tudor, Henry Tudor, and Mary Tudor. Margaret Tudor went on to marry the Scottish King James IV, and it is through Margaret Tudor that you can trace the Tudor bloodline all the way down to our king of today, King Charles III. Their second surviving child, Arthur Tudor, was the one who was originally betrothed to Catherine of Aragon. They married in 1501 when they were both around 15 years old, but sadly Arthur Tudor died in 1502 and Catherine of Aragon went on to marry his brother, Henry Tudor, who became Henry VIII. Mary Tudor was briefly Queen of France and then married Henry VIII's best friend, Charles Brandon. She is also the grandmother of Jane Grey. Despite having ended the War of the Roses essentially with his marriage to Elizabeth of York, Henry Tudor was not necessarily a very well-liked king. He was known to be a very anxious king, he was very paranoid, and he was known to be a miser. He passed illegal taxations on the nobles, which of course did not gain him any brownie points. And by the end of his reign, many nobles were already showing favour to his son, Prince Harry, who would one day succeed him and become Henry VIII. This led Henry Tudor to basically lock up his son under the pretense that he was keeping him safe since he was his only surviving male child and England needed a future king. After the death of his first son Arthur Tudor in 1502, it is fair to say that he was just trying to keep his son Henry from also dying before his time. However, some believe that he was actually secretly paranoid that as his son gained favor with the nobles, he would usurp his own father. In the end, these fears were irrelevant because Henry Tudor died in 1509 of supposedly tuberculosis, and his son Henry VIII became King of England.